Well, we are midweek in our conversation with David Welch. We welcome him back. He is CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. David will be joining us for the rest of this week as well. Last night, we looked at the recent success of international courts and tribunals. Tonight, we'll take a look at political trials and to what extent they are compatible with the rule of law. Hi again, David.
Nice to see you again.
Well, the last few months, we've seen a lot going on in the Middle East. And one of the areas we want to discuss is Egypt and the way political trials have been and will be used in Egypt. But first, lay the groundwork for me. Are political trials better classified as law or politics?
First question would be, what's a political trial? And actually, that's a question with not a very clear-cut answer. People normally distinguish at least 4 different kinds of political trials. The kind I think you're most interested in tonight are where a former ruler of a country is tried by the courts or some other mechanism in their country for crimes committed in his or her role as a head of state or head of government. It's sort of the narrowest definition. The broadest definition would be any trial conducted for a political purpose. And it could be to destroy an opposition party or to take out a particular opponent, some sort of trumped up trial.
Show trial.
Show trial of some kind. And then there are other species in between those two extremes where trials take place for political rather than sort of objective judicial reasons. So the question you asked was, to what extent are these kinds of trials, legal? They can be sort of superficially legal. The difficulty with these kinds of trials is that they're almost always conducted by opponents of whoever's on trial, under rules that are sometimes jerry-rigged to try to guarantee a conviction of some kind, sometimes under laws that are passed ex post. In other words, you did something 20 years ago, it wasn't illegal then, somebody passes a law yesterday that would have made it illegal, and they try you tomorrow and convict you. Well, it wasn't illegal at the time. Some countries' constitutions prohibit that kind of ex post law, including the United States Constitution. But there are cases around the world where political trials take place on the basis of these.
So if we look at the case of Egypt, post-Mubarak, opposition, interim government, opposition in control could go back and say what Mubarak did in his decades in power is now considered illegal, and therefore he will be tried under some of those charges.
They could. Now, it remains to be seen exactly how this kind of trial will unfold. And Egypt could do this right, or it could do it wrong. If they do it wrong, they'll do it more or less the way every other similar trial has ever been conducted since Charles I. Basically, former heads of state or government, when they're tried this kind of way, they're convicted. And they're convicted in ways that are transparently not objective. So Egypt could go that route. On the other hand, Egypt could say, all right, here was the law in place at the time when Mubarak was the president. Here are jurists who don't have a dog in this fight politically. Here is a perfectly competent defense team to work on behalf of Mr. Mubarak and give him the best possible defense. And if we see that kind of thing, it might actually speak positively about the future of the rule of law in Egypt. The trouble with these kinds of trials is that even if you do make an effort to do it right, if the person is found guilty, it's very often easy for people to say, well, yes, of course, they just put lipstick on the pig, but in fact, it's still a pig. It really wasn't a fair trial from the get-go.
Okay, I want to read something that Egyptian journalist Yasmin Fati wrote this past May. Here's some of what she wrote. Inevitable has become the favorite word of many revolutionaries. If Egypt's legal system can't bring justice, then maybe we should, they say to one another. How can we try Mubarak and his officials using laws that they manipulated to make their shady deals legal, they demand? Of course they won't find anything on him. He was a dictator and no one would have dared to keep records of his dodgy activities, they shout. As the voices of discontent rose, so did calls for political trials by revolutionaries hungry for justice and increasingly worried that symbols of the old regime will get away with their crimes after all. David Welch, why do some Egyptians see political trials as the only way to bring about justice and not the laws that are on the books?
Well, the question is, why would you want to try Hosni Mubarak? There's a couple of reasons why you might want to do that. One is you just disagreed with his politics, you thought he was bad for the country, and you want to get back at him somehow, and so you turn to the law, and you hope that the courts will do it for you. They'll punish him for bad politics. That's not what a trial should be for. A trial should be for seeing whether somebody violated the law. So again, if you're going to do this right, you look at the Egyptian law and you ask, what was on paper as authoritative law in Egypt at the time when Mubarak did A, B, and C, and were A, B, and C illegal under Egyptian law? And if the answer is yes, then fine. You've got a perfectly justifiable basis for a prosecution. And if somebody writes a law clearly enough, you can hoist them on their own petard by easily showing that they violated it. So for example, almost every country has laws against misappropriation of public funds. Well, if there's $2.5 billion in a bank account in Switzerland with the Mubarak family name on it, and it's easily traceable to, say, Egyptian customs revenues or something like that, that clearly would be an example of an indictable offense under current Egyptian law. So that's the kind of thing you have to look for if you want to try to make the best possible effort to avoid these things looking like show trials.
Some human rights activists in Egypt are saying it's not Egyptian law that's the problem, that there are enough articles within that law to punish Mubarak and bring about justice, but that they argue that the prosecution is not just. What do they mean by that?
Some people think that you should ever prosecute a head of state or government, right? That by definition, a head of state or government should be above the law, should be immune from the law. That's a decreasingly popular view. That used to be the prevailing view, way back in the heyday of the divine rights of kings, right? The kings and queens were thought to answer only to God, and the idea that they could be tried, or let alone charged, let alone tried with anything in their own country by anybody else would seem absurd. And we only began to see the beginning of the change in that in Magna Carta, way back with King John in England. So over time, gradually the idea that heads of state or government are themselves bound by law has taken root, but it hasn't taken root everywhere, and it hasn't taken root everywhere equally quickly. And as we all remember from the famous Frost interviews, even Richard Nixon declared on national television in a fit of heat that if the president does it, it's not illegal. Well, that's not true. He was wrong about that. But rulers often feel that way, and sometimes rulers' supporters feel that way as well.
As we look at the changes in the Middle East, do you think rulers now have come to the realization that things have changed? If we think of how long most of these rulers have been in place, decades and decades, and now they're slowly coming to the realization that, wait a minute, I am going to be tried for that. I mean, is that realization significant to what we're seeing going on in the Middle East?
If I were a dictator anywhere in the world, I would increasingly think that I'm probably not going to get away with anything anymore. 20, 30 years ago, I wouldn't think that. I would think I can go away and live in exile perfectly happily somewhere and nobody will bother me again. That's what happened with baby Doc Duvalier. That's what happened with Idi Amin from Uganda. Off they went. The world didn't pay any attention to them anymore. Nowadays, if those guys left office under the conditions that they left office back then, decades ago, they almost certainly could expect to be hunted down and indicted and tried. So I do think it does change the calculus for sitting dictators. Now, it can break in a good way or in a bad way. The good way is it makes them behave better. So knowing that they could be prosecuted, well, they won't do the things that are awful enough to get them prosecuted. Or it could mean they'll just dig in. And there's some real fear, for example, that somebody like Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, who clearly thinks that he's a target for international prosecution based on everything he's done since independence, is probably just going to hunker down and dig in because he fears, probably rightly, that if he doesn't, he'll wind up in The Hague.
That he's got nothing to lose.
Exactly.
Some critics say that systems that have political trials, it's really a disease of a not well-run political or legal system, that citizens have to turn to political trials when they feel that the current system that they have is corrupt. How much truth is there to that?
Well, a lot depends upon the body politic and what is it that is required to satisfy the body politic to sort of turn a page of history and move forward with their lives. And the answer to that question differs depending on which country you're talking about and which time you're talking about. And in some places of the world, you didn't necessarily need a political trial. For example, South Africa after apartheid. South Africans, partly because Nelson Mandela was willing to rise above it and do this, basically decided to live with the fact that former Nationalist Party leaders would not be charged ex post with crimes for everything horrible that they did under the era of apartheid. But what they had instead was, a Peace and Reconciliation Commission, a sort of opportunity for the victims of apartheid to have their stories told and heard. And the idea was that that would relieve the public pressure and let South Africa move on from its past and rebuild a new democratic future. Other countries, such as the United States, Richard Nixon clearly was guilty of crimes and probably should have stood trial. Well, he was pardoned by Jerry Ford. And in the US Constitution, a sitting president can pardon somebody for a crime. And Ford took a lot of flack for that because there were enough people who opposed Nixon bitterly that they really wanted to see him stand trial. But in the grand scheme of things, that was probably the healthiest thing to do for American politics, because that was the fastest way to get the country to sort of turn the page, move past the Nixon era, move past Watergate, and get on with life.
You mentioned South Africa and the States. I want to talk about some other political trials in the past. I want to read what Barbara Falk, professor at Canadian Forces College, had to say on the subject. This was published back in August of 2009. The rehabilitation of the Slansky trial victims, for example, was an important precursor to the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. Similar calls for reevaluating the trial victims that preceded the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Although both these movements were eventually crushed by Soviet tanks, these trials and the political repression they represented helped spell eventual doom for the authoritarian communist rulers of these two states. They became enduring symbols of illegitimacy and corruption. Moreover, as with the Moscow show trials of the 1930s, such trials do little to garner support from abroad, and those who were duped given their own commitment to communism were later reminded of their gullibility. Political trials have a tendency to generate more shame than justice. David, do you agree with that assessment of political trials?
I think she's right about those two cases in particular. And as I said earlier, there is a danger that this kind of political trial will always be written off as rigged from the get-go, which will almost never work to the benefit of what happens next in that country, respect for the legal system, and so forth and so on. Still, having said that, sometimes the political trial does provide a catharsis. And so I would offer up as another example the trial of Saddam Hussein. Well, in a sense, that fits the mold of a standard political trial because he was tried by opponents of the Ba'athist regime or people he had purged from the Ba'ath Party. And you would not look at it and find a lot of people involved in the process who could be said to have been at all sympathetic to Saddam Hussein. Why not? Well, partly because everybody was a victim of Saddam Hussein, and frankly, there weren't many people left, except for his close family members, who looked at him in a positive light. So even though that probably was a trial with a preordained outcome, it did provide a kind of catharsis for Iraq. And after he was tried, found guilty, and hanged, people of Iraq did more or less put the Saddam Hussein era behind them. They still had plenty of problems left to grapple with, but at least that particular ghost had been exorcised.
Earlier in the week, we talked about the difficulty of coming up with an international consensus of the word justice because of so many different cultures and beliefs at play. And I want to translate that into political trials. To what extent are they really a reflection of the country's form of government?
Pretty fundamentally, yeah. So if you have a country whose political sociology is oriented towards, single party, strong leadership, authoritarianism, you probably can expect more in the way of political trials. And probably they would have more acceptance. That kind of thing is a harder sell in a liberal, pluralistic democracy where people expect opponents politically to respect each other, where there's a tradition of loyal opposition. If you had a political trial of that kind in Canada, it wouldn't go over well with anybody. And so it wouldn't work to anybody's advantage. Somebody who prosecuted somebody that way would themselves be put at a political disadvantage. So it really does depend quite significantly on context.
You know what's interesting is these dictators, you mentioned Mugabe, who basically is thumbing his nose at the idea of these trials. But governments as brutal as Stalin, for example, still felt the need to cover their actions through show trials. That's interesting to me. What do you think let me use that in quotes, for them to do that is?
Well, I've actually always found that kind of thing a little bit puzzling, because the question to my mind always was, who does he think he's fooling? And it may be that that was just a ritualistic exercise, wasn't intended actually to prosecute anybody for anything, but simply to signal, I'm in charge, and I get to say how things run around here. And if that's all it was, then it really is understandable. But that has nothing to do with prosecuting somebody for committing a crime. It has everything to do with simply signaling a power relationship.
That's all our time for today. David, thank you very much.
You're welcome.